All right, let's get going here. So a couple things off the top. So I'll mention this, kind of revisit it at the end of class. I put it up in the recorded lecture at the very beginning. I also mentioned it week one, kind of discussing how to approach those Canvas discussions. So I posted that, put an announcement up after last Thursday's class. So it's been open for you to kind of get on and respond to that. I'll go through that at the end of class again, just in case you haven't started that. But that'll be due at the end of the day Monday, along with the week 3 quiz, and then the module 4 reading will pop up after class as well. Okay. So I believe I've got it set correct. So that those quiz results, and I think I mentioned this Tuesday, you won't be able to view them until after the due date passes. I mean, you can see your score, but it won't show you which ones you got right or wrong. You won't be able to review that until it's closed out for everyone. Okay, so that'll pop up. I think I have it set to be Tuesday at 1 in the morning, right? Other than that, my office hours, have a lot of people stop by yesterday. I'm going to have some additional office hours on Friday. I put up an announcement. I originally thought they'd be 8 to 10. I'm still waiting on a response, which I should have later today, about something that a meeting I have. I don't know exactly what time it'll be tomorrow. So it may not be 8 to 10. My office hours are likely going to be something more like 10 to noon or 11 to 1 tomorrow. Look for an announcement. I'll get that posted tonight or later this afternoon once I hear back. And then I'll have my kind of typical office hours next week, barring any crazy weather again, back to kind of 9:30, 12:30 on Monday. Okay. Any questions for me before we dive into material here today? All right. So don't want to look at me in the recording. So let's go to the slideshow and we'll kind of pick up where we left off, right? So we started talking about supply, right? And it was this combination, just like demand, of the price of a good, but not the quantity demanded, the quantity supply. We started to think about the price for a producer or someone selling something is a good thing, right? And so when we talked it through what the supply curve represents, we said, essentially, if the demand curve tells us the marginal benefit to the consumers, right, the very first price they'd be willing to pay, the price from the supply curve tells us the very first price at which the supplier would provide that good to the market. Or it must be that's the price that would be equal to whatever their marginal cost is. So our supply curve is going to represent marginal costs. So we can think about it this way. If I had an equation, and I think here we had an easy one to kind of start out. So this is my relationship between price and the quantity supply. We said as the price goes up, our producer is going to want to provide more or less to the market. More, because price to them is a good thing. Now, we said, kind of similar to demand, we can think of that price doesn't reflect marginal benefits to consumers, but the marginal cost to the producers of the firms. So if I want to know the marginal cost of any quantity, all I have to do is plug in what quantity I'm interested in. So the marginal cost of that first unit would be what? Here, 0.33 repeated. What if I wanted the marginal cost of providing the 9th unit? Well, we know as a producer produces more and more, they're having to rely on less and less efficient workers or less and less efficient resources. So every unit they produce is going to cost them more than the previous one. So as they produce more, what am I going to have to do to convince them to produce more, to provide that to the market? I would have to increase the price. The price to them is their marginal benefit. They're only going to provide this good to the market if that price or the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to their marginal cost. So this supply curve is telling us the very first price that they would supply that good to the market, or what that marginal cost of that unit must have been. So if I wanted the marginal cost of the 9th, I'd plug 9 in here, and I get what? The marginal cost of providing that 9th unit would be 3, or the price must be at least $3 for them to provide that good to the market. If the price is anything higher, then they're definitely going to provide it, right? But the very first price that they would provide that good to the market would be at that price of 9, or their marginal cost. So I think I drew them on the same graph last class, but here we're just going to focus on supply to start out today. And I'll go through this pretty quickly because it's kind of similar to what we did with demand, and I want to make sure we have more time to work through what we call equilibrium. Okay. So if I've got this supply curve, we said it represents the marginal costs to the producers. Every unit they produce, the marginal cost of the first is much lower than the marginal cost of the ninth. And we can kind of see that by plugging those quantities into our supply curve. So let's think about if this represents my marginal costs, essentially, I can think of the supply curve as representing how much it costs me to produce each one of these goods. So if I'm thinking about something where all of a sudden, let's say, here's a good example. I'm producing something in a line like, I don't know, a fast food chain. And all of a sudden, the government increases the minimum wage. Well, now the resources I was using, what has happened? To have the same number of workers, I'm now going to have to pay a higher amount if that minimum wage is binding. So at every unit, to provide that same unit to the market, my marginal costs are now higher. So anytime the costs, or what we call kind of like the input prices, how much the raw materials, maybe it's, all of a sudden plastic prices increase. If I'm producing something that's made of plastic, like children's toys, my costs are now going to be high, no matter how much I'm producing. So if the input prices could be labor, could be plastic in my other example, if they go up at every single quantity, the marginal costs are now higher. So what has happened to my supply curve? Well, if it's more costly to produce this, am I going to provide more or less to the market than before? Less. So this would represent a supply. So input prices go up. We can think of that as it's my marginal cost. That, how much it costs me to produce something is part of, those input prices. What has happened to supply? Supply has decreased. So another way of thinking about this is no matter what the price is, when my input prices go up, I am now producing less than before. So just kind of saying something in a different way, we're thinking about it on the X versus the Y axis, or Y versus the X axis. So decreases in supply, just like demand, are leftward shifts. I don't like to use the language of up and downward. No, we have to say that it's a supply increase or decrease, but visually on the graph, a demand decrease was a shift to the left. We were getting closer to that 0 point. Supply decreases, same idea. It's a shift to the left, or we're getting closer to 0. Now here's where it gets a little bit confusing because a supply decrease is a shift to the left, but it looks like it's a shift up. Kind of seems counterintuitive. But the reason why it's shifting up is because it's representing that our costs are going up. If our costs are going up, that means that at the same price, we're going to provide less to the market, or supply is decreasing. Okay? So on the flip side, let's say, and this is where I'll kind of kill two birds with one stone, kind of some of the slides we'll go through quickly because we're talking about it right now. What's something else that's going to impact my input prices? So let's say I've got a supply curve. It represents my marginal costs. What if all of a sudden, right, I'm producing something and maybe I was doing online customer support, and I now have ChatGPT that my workers can put things into and get answers very quickly, right? Some automated responses when people call in my customer service hotline. Well, when technology improves, what is that going to do to my input prices? I can now produce the same number, but I'm not going to need as many resources. So when we see technology improvements, what's happened to the marginal cost? No matter what the price or what quantity I'm producing, the marginal costs are now lower. So if at every quantity, my costs or my marginal costs are now lower, what has happened to supply? Supply has increased, right? So technology improvements decrease my costs. I'm now willing to supply more to the market because the goods cost me less to produce. So supply increases are going to look like this kind of rightward, right, shift, or moving further from 0. That's why I say right and leftward. There, it doesn't matter if we're talking about supply or demand. They kind of visually will look the same, right, left or right. Now, once again, kind of counterintuitive. This is why I don't use upward and downward. Supply increases look like the supply curve is going down. right? But that's just a visual trick, right? It's that we don't want to rely on upward, downward shifts. The fact that supply is increasing is meaning at the same price, we now are providing more to the market. That's why a rightward shift represents a supply increase. So just like demand, we can have shifts in supply. We've already talked about two of those things, input prices and technology. Okay. So we go back here. I'll kind of skip through this. We kind of talked about this last class, and this will kind of set us up for another thing that shifts supply. Just like demand, I don't have one producer of a good. In fact, we said last class, we're assuming right now that we're looking at what we call perfectly competitive markets. There's many, many buyers, many, many sellers. So if I try to increase the price, everybody else is just going to buy from another company, right? Someone else is going to be able to undercut my price a little bit. So if we have multiple producers, at every price, the total market supply would be each producer's supply at that price added together. Just like we took individual demand to find market demand. So nothing really different here. We now would kind of graph out not individual supply curves, but we would take the combination of price and market supply, graph that out. That's our market supply. That's what we're interested in. Okay? So what do you think happens if I add a third producer in this example? At every price, the market quantity supplied is going to go up, just like for consumers, right? We added more, or sorry, just like for demand. When we added more consumers, our market demand curve increased. If we add more producers, there's more firms that enter this market. We're going to see that the overall market supply at every price is going to now be higher. So more producers is going to increase supply. We've got another thing that's going to shift that supply curve. Okay? So here's our market supply. We kind of talked about some things that would shift it. Once again, I would not rely on this kind of upward or downward. I would think about these as shifts to the left and the right. Shifts to the right, further away from zero, that's a supply increase. Shifts to the left, right, getting close to that 0 point, supply decrease. So we talked through what these kind of look like already. A little bit of summary here in the slides. We talked about input prices. You might have kind of a quick summary here. I sometimes will do this instead of drawing a visual out for every single one. We really just care about like the directional changes. So input prices go up, more costly to produce something, supplies them go down. Input prices become cheaper, right? My workers are now more effective. My input prices go down, supply and provide more to the market. So I don't know, I had some other examples here. You know, you think about my dumb Starbucks drink example. If it requires milk to produce that good, and all of a sudden the price of milk skyrockets, well, my marginal costs have went up. I'm going to provide or supply less to the market. So we talked through input prices. We said, you know, by lower input prices, it's going to look like a supply increase, right? What else would lower my input prices? Improvements in technology, right? So this is where, you know, we love technology because if it's lower input prices, what are we getting at the same price? More is now supplied to the market. Now, are there examples where we see technology development? Maybe, I don't know, during times of war or something like that, but usually information isn't just lost. Maybe if we go back to thinking about, like, I don't know, the Egyptians or something, right? There might have been a moment in time where technology took a step back, but more often than not, we just think about technology improvements. And those are the types of examples I would give you because they're the most relevant to the real world. Any questions? Yeah.
Is technology like the biggest? Or
the biggest?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the size of the shifts, it depends, right? If I have a technology improvement and it doesn't really impact the sector very much, no, right? If I see, you know, creation of generative AI, is that going to impact the market for milk? Maybe a little bit, but probably not a lot, right? Is it going to impact the market for online sales? So different, yeah, a lot, right? So different markets will be impacted differently by technology changes. That shift could be very large, could be very small. Just kind of depends on the market, right? Any other questions at this point? I'm going through this kind of quick, but these shifts should look a lot, you know, built kind of a good base on Tuesday, thinking about demand. Very similar with supply. We talked about the number of sellers already. That one I think is pretty intuitive, very similar to demand. More producers increases our supply curve and vice versa, right? Now, here's where it gets a little bit different. And here's where we have to start putting ourselves in the mindset of suppliers. If I was selling a good, okay? So if I'm selling a good and all of a sudden, I might have markets, this is kind of a catch-all category. It's probably specific to whatever good we're talking about, but there could be market expectations. So if I think that all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I look at the current weather patterns and I think that it's going to be a really cold winter. If I'm someone who's selling natural gas and it's the summer, and I think during the winter it's going to be really, really cold, people are going to need natural gas. People are going to be willing to pay higher prices. If I can sell this good for a higher price in the future, do I want to sell it now or later? If I'm selling something, I want the price to be high. So what might I do? Stockpile things in the summer, have this huge supply of natural gas, then provide in the market in the winter where I can now sell it for a higher price. So all these market expectations, you could think through, I use natural gas here, but this could be any good that we might think is going to have like an increase in price later. So these market expectations are really linked to price expectations. So kind of unlike consumers, if you're buying something, if you think the price is going to be higher tomorrow, when do you want to buy it? Today. So current demand would go up. If I'm selling something, if I think the price I can sell it for is going to be higher tomorrow, what happens to my current supply? Decreases. It's the exact opposite effect as it would have on consumers. And that's because price is the exact opposite thing for a producer versus it's a bad thing for consumers, good thing for producers. Price is higher. So higher prices expected in the future will lower current supply. Now, if I think that, I don't know, maybe there's a good and it's a fad, right? So I'll go back. I think I used the example last class. I put a picture up of fidget spinners, right? At one point in time, everyone liked them for some godforsaken reason. If I think it's a fad and that a year from now, nobody's going to want this and no one's going to want to pay a high price, what do I want to make sure I do right now? Sell a lot of them. So if I think it's a fad good, what's going to happen to current supply if I think the price in the future is going to be low? Current supply is going to go way up. You're going to see a bunch of people. I saw this, thought about this actually after the national championship game. I was kind of driving around and seeing like all these people put up these tents and selling like their own t-shirts that they made, right? Not licensed through anyone. Why are they doing it? What do they think is going to happen a year from now to how much people are willing to pay for a national championship t-shirt? They think it's going to be a lot lower than what it currently is. So what do they want to do today? Supply it all now, right? Lower expected prices increase our current supply, right? So we can kind of see this expectation of prices. We could think about either higher or lower expected prices. So this is where we're talking about supply. We've got to take a step back and remember, most of us aren't producers. We've got to put ourselves in the mindset of a firm. And for a firm, higher prices are a good thing, lower prices are a bad thing. Okay? Is that making sense? Any questions on that? And we could go through and draw these shifts, but I've kind of already done that for you. We just kind of draw them the exact same way, right? Increases in supply, shifts to the right, decreases in supply, shifts to the left. Now, looks like my animation's being brought in PowerPoint here. But if I had substitutes in production, this is going to be something we talked about with demand, but a little bit different for supply. So if I have substitutes in production, so let's say I've got these two goods, and I'll just kind of draw this out so we get some more practice doing this. So here's my current supply curve, right? And we'll kind of think about this as good X, right? And then actually let's do, I don't know. We'll call this like drug A, right? So I'm a pharmaceutical company, and I'm thinking about my supply of a specific drug. If I have a production process that's set up that can create pills, right, and create any chemical composition, I can create any pill that I want to with my production facility. If all of a sudden the price of some other drug skyrockets, right? If I have a production process set up that I can produce drug A or drug B, what good am I more likely to want to produce now? The drug that has a higher price. So what's going to happen to my supply of the drug that didn't have a price increase? A lot of companies are going to change their production process, no longer produce drug A. they're going to produce drug B. So the supply curve for drug A is going to go down or decrease. And these should be parallel shifts. I'm just trying to draw in this quickly, right? Anything that we draw here, we can think of as parallel shifts. So when we have substitutes in production, I can produce either this good or that good. My production process is set up to produce either one. When the price of a good Y goes up, here I was kind of using the example of another drug, the supply of good X actually goes down. And then it'd work the exact opposite. If all of a sudden I see the price of drug B plummets, no one is wanting to get this drug anymore because I don't know, maybe some adverse, I don't know, maybe it was a vaccine that adverse side effects came out about, right? So if that's the case, people are no longer willing to pay as high of a price. I want to change my production process from producing drug B to now producing drug A. Or a change in the price of a substitute in production, when it goes down, the supply of the other good, right, is now going to go up. So I can think about this was kind of scenario 2. Here would be kind of scenario 3 for my original supply. So that's substitutes in production. A little bit trickier one. I think this one's kind of easy to think about because I want to be producing whatever good has a higher price. So whatever good has a higher price, I'll produce more of that, less of the other. What's probably a little bit more tricky, and there's not a lot of great examples of this. I think I have this example in the slides. If I don't, I should have. Because I noticed this. I was always like, had this really hard time thinking of examples for what we call complements in production. Okay? So complements in consumption makes more sense. We tend to use peanut butter and jelly at the same time to make a sandwich. We tend to make, buy electric vehicles and their batteries at the same time, right? Complements in production mean that when I'm producing one good, at the same time, I'm getting another product as well. So used to, have a hard time thinking about these examples, and people would be like, if I'm producing 2x4s, like lumber, what inherently am I going to get? Sawdust. That's kind of a good example, and that's something that applies to the real world. I was at a distillery over COVID back in the day, and what was interesting is I started talking to the guy, and they're like, okay, look, all of a sudden, and maybe I should spell this out, but I'll use kind of HS as moving forward. During COVID, what do you think happened to the price of hand sanitizer? Went way up, right? So the price of this hand sanitizer went way up. Well, in the production of different liquors, inherently they get this byproduct, which is like pure alcohol, pure ethanol or something. And they can't use it for anything. Usually they would just dump it. They couldn't sell it. Well, what they found was you can actually take that and basically 100% alcohol is hand sanitizer, right? So by making these different liquors, they were inherently getting this other product at the same time, which could then be used and sold as hand sanitizer. So if the price of hand sanitizer went way up, what do you think happened to the quantity? I chose whiskey here, but of these different liquors. Well, and I say quantity here, quantity supplied, or I could think about this as my supply of this liquor. If the price of hand sanitizer went up, now when I'm producing liquor, if I'm also getting hand sanitizer, am I going to be more or less likely to want to produce these liquor products? More likely. They're not substitutes. When I produce more whiskey, I'm inherently also getting this byproduct that is hand sanitizer. Well, I now have this good that I used to just have to dump. I couldn't sell it for anything. Now I can sell it for a much higher price. I'm now okay making more of good X because the good I'm getting at the same time, good Y, I can now sell that for a higher price. So when we have complements in production, when the price of one of those goods that goes up, the supply of the other product increases. Same idea. For some reason, all of a sudden, sawdust could be sold for millions of dollars. What am I going to do? I'm going to create more 2x4s so I get this byproduct of sawdust. That's kind of the general idea. And then it would work the exact opposite. If I all of a sudden after COVID, people don't want to pay as high a prices for hand sanitizer, So hand sanitizer prices have went way down. What's going to happen to the supply of whiskey or these different liquors? Well, now my byproduct isn't worth very much. So supply of the good that I was producing to get that byproduct is going to go down. Right? Kind of, just works in the opposite direction. So we have substitutes and complements in production as well, just like we did for consumption. It's just the relationship works different. Because when complements consumption, price is a bad thing for consumers. Here, price is a good thing for producers. Any questions on that? Okay. So, kind of walk through. This is kind of just in general terms. I had a specific example that I was thinking about, which is kind of this whiskey hand sanitizer example. My previous example doing substitutes in production. You could also think about this if I have a field and I can produce different crops. The price of corn goes up. I'm more likely to want to plant corn in my field than I am soybeans. A very Indiana thing. So one final thing that we'll talk about with supply that can kind of increase or decrease supply. And it's once again pretty much directly related to something we've already talked about. So if I tax instead of consumers, if I tax producers, so this is usually when you think of examples where it's like if what I'm producing creates a lot of pollution, what the government might do is say, oh, for every ton of gasoline that you produce, we're going to tax you a certain amount because the production of that product creates a lot of pollution. If I tax producers, essentially what have I done? I've changed their, something we already talked about, input prices. Produce the same amount as I was before. It's the same. I pay the same amount of workers, same raw materials, but I now also have to pay a tax for every unit. So what's going to happen to my supply curve? If input prices go up, we said people are going to be less likely to supply. So taxes will decrease our supply curve. Once again, pretty intuitive because taxes we think of as usually are a bad thing, right? They would lower supply. So if we tax producers, that lowers our supply curve. If I instead subsidize a product, so this is where like in Indiana, a lot of different crops are subsidized, right? The government gives you money for producing a certain crop. If I'm given money for producing something, my marginal cost is whatever it was before, but now it's going to be a little bit lower because I'm also getting some money back from the government. So when I subsidize a product, it's essentially lowering the cost of the producer, so supply is going to increase. So taxes, subsidies kind of work pretty similar as they did for consumers. We tax consumers, demand decrease. Tax producers, supply decreases. Subsidize consumers, they want to buy more, demand increases. Subsidize producers, they want to supply more, or supply increases.
What could be an example of subsidizing, like if you buy something, like where it continues to.
So we talked about this last class. What was one I said most of you are actually probably getting? A lot of you get federal aid, right? So that's essentially a subsidy. A bunch of different programs for lower income people, like WIC programs, where you're given food stamps or something like that. You're essentially given money to get different products. So we have examples where we have subsidies to both consumers and producers. So here's kind of a summary of all those things, just put into one slide. We've kind of talked through all of them. The next thing that I want to talk about, and want to make sure we have enough time to go through this, is, okay, we now know all the things that would shift supply or shift demand, but where does the price of a good come from, right? We know that consumers are going to buy less when the price goes up, but we know that producers want to sell more when the price goes up. We have these competing effects. So what's going to end up being true, and I'll kind of just give you a little bit of like, here's the answer, and then we'll work through why, is our equilibrium point is going to be the quantity where supply is equal to demand. So it'll be the price at which the quantity supplied in the market is exactly the same as the quantity demanded, okay? So if I'm thinking visually, what would that look like? Well, if I drew out my market demand, my market supply curve, the point where they intersect, this is the price where the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. Everybody who is producing a good can find a consumer to sell it to. at that price. So let's think about, if we're looking at a table, how would I identify that? Well, it's the price at which my quantity demanded, or my demand curve, is equal to my quantity supply, or where those two curves intersect. So I said I'll kind of go through the reasoning here in a second. For now, we're just going to identify that's that point that we would call the equilibrium of this market. Now, why does that exist? Okay, so we'll kind of talk through surpluses and shortages here. Or why is that equilibrium the point where supply is equal to demand? So if I think about putting both supply and demand on the same graph, I've got supply, which represents the producer's marginal costs, and demand, which represents the consumer's marginal benefits. Let's go through a thought experiment and say, okay, let's assume we weren't at this equilibrium point. I'm going to set this up two ways. So if I think about it this way, let's assume that the current price is right here. At this price, right, nobody past this quantity is going to buy the good because their marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost of it. However, every single producer, what's true about the price to them? It represents the producer's marginal benefit. So at every single unit here, I would provide these goods to the market, even if the price was a little bit lower. So if we have many, many firms and they're all competing, what would I do? Well, this is the current price of the good. If I'm a company, I'm going to sell it at a slightly lower price. That price is still above my marginal cost. So you can kind of think about it for now, and we'll complicate it later on in the semester. But it's almost like that difference between the price and the marginal cost to a firm would be kind of like profits, right? I can still earn profits even if I charge a price that's lower than the current price. Well, if that's the case, now there's a company out there that says, well, look, my marginal cost is still here. I would actually sell it for an even lower price, be able to sell a higher quantity, and I'm still earning a profit. If there's many firms that are selling this good, essentially they keep lowering the price until that profit margin is essentially zero. At that point, they're indifferent. So this would occur all the way to the point where the price, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Now, if I lower the price anymore at a quantity past that, now the firm's marginal cost would be above that price. We wouldn't provide that to the market. So this is just kind of an intuition as to why that equilibrium quantity and price end up being what they are. Because if it was anything higher, firms would kind of keep undercutting each other's prices until we get driven down to that equilibrium point. Now, another way of thinking about this, instead of, I'm going to give you two ways of thinking about the same thing, is if I'm thinking about, okay, here's my supply, my demand curve. Let's say I was looking at, here's kind of my current price, right? At that price, here's my quantity demanded. Here would be my quantity supplied. Okay. So at this price, fewer people are willing to buy the good than companies that are willing to sell it. So if nobody's going to buy my good, do I want to produce it? Well, essentially, the price is only the marginal benefit to me if I can sell that product, right? So if the price is this high, every unit in this range, there's nobody willing to buy these. What's the profit margin of the firm going to be? Well, if I do produce that good and I can't sell it, negative whatever my costs are, right? So we would supply less to the market. As we supply less to the market, we're willing to take lower prices. So now if the price is kind of fallen to here, now, I guess I should use colors here. So if this is now the new lower price as firms stop producing this good, now the difference between my quantity demanded and my quantity supplied has gotten much lower, right? And this kind of exists, right? If I now have more units than people are willing to buy, I still have units I can't sell to anybody. I'm losing money on those. I start producing less and less until we get to this point where at this kind of third price, now the quantity demanded is exactly the same as my quantity supplied. I'm selling every single unit I'm producing. That's where we stop. Okay? So you think about either through price or kind of quantity, while we arrive at that equilibrium point. So if we weren't in equilibrium, what we would call this, if the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. So if firms are producing more units than people are willing to buy, I would call that a surplus. Okay, I have a bunch of units that I am not able to support, sell to anyone in the market. I have a surplus of units. I have units that I'm not able to sell. What if I was at a point where the quantity demanded was greater than the quantity supplied? Well, now more people want to buy this good than what is currently being produced. So we would call that a shortage. So if we're not equilibrium, we're going to have surpluses and shortages. And I'll probably go through the slides relatively quickly because I'll kind of draw out something that I think will help summarize this idea. So if I'm thinking about surpluses and shortages now, when I'm in equilibrium or I'm at this point where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, do I have a surplus or a shortage? Neither, right? I'm selling exactly how many units I'm producing. If the price is ever, so here we have that equilibrium price. If I ever have a price that is above that equilibrium, if the price is higher, are more or less people going to want to buy it? Less. But if the price is higher, are more people going to be willing to supply it? More. So at ranges where this price is higher than the equilibrium, every price in this range, what's going to be true about the quantity demanded relative to the quantity supplied? Quantity supplied is always going to be greater, or at any price above the equilibrium, we're going to have a what? The amount being supplied is more than the amount people are willing to buy. We're going to have a surplus. I guess I should have done this with blue since that's a match up here. Anytime I have a price that's below that equilibrium point, at all of these prices, the quantity supplied, or the point I'm at on my supply curve, relative to the quantity demanded, well, here, quantity supplied is less than my quantity demanded. So at every price in this range, more people want to buy this good than is being provided to the market. So I'm going to have a shortage. Okay. So we kind of think about any price above that equilibrium point, we've got a surplus. Any point below it, we've got a shortage. Okay. And we could determine what those values are by simply plugging the price in to our supply and demand equations and coming up with what the corresponding quantity supplied and quantity demanded would be. So here's kind of maybe like a little bit more of a summary of these. We'll go through this relatively quickly and start to think about shifts in our supply and demand curve.
So are shortages only better for companies when they're selling their individual products?
They're not necessarily a good thing, right? So why do we not end up seeing the equilibrium be a shortage? Well, if there's more people that want to buy a good than what I'm currently producing, what am I going to do? Produce more, right? So it's not really a good thing for the company because I'm leaving something on the table, right? If I were to produce more units and I could find someone to buy them, well, I could earn profit on that additional unit. It would, but as long as we're in a range where we're not in equilibrium, that price is still going to be above my marginal cost, right? So in fact, we'll kind of think about if I have a short, well, I'll come back to your question. If I haven't answered here in a second, I'll revisit it once being. But I want to go through this in a certain order just for the sake to make sense. Okay? So we started out, we said the equilibrium is where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. I don't have to just look at this visually on a graph. I can look at a table and say, okay, if the price wasn't this equilibrium price of 3, instead I'm at a price of 5. If the quantity demanded is less than my quantity supplied, I've got a surplus in the number of units. Okay? So I can get this information from a table or a graph. We kind of went through the graphs already. but a graph just comes from a table, right? It comes from this combination of price and quantity demanded. That's our demand curve. Price and quantity supplied. That's our supply curve. Okay? So we can identify this surplus from a graph or looking at a table. Okay? If I'm thinking about instead, I kind of already went through this. If we do have a surplus, well, I've got units I can't sell. I'm going to start producing less and less, which lowers the price until I'm selling every single unit that I'm producing, right? Until we get back to that equilibrium point. Now, to the same point, if I have instead of a surplus, right? So instead of, not enough, there's more supply than demand. What if I've got demand being too high, right? So in this example, I'd said, okay, what if the price is below that equilibrium of 3? Let's say it's 1. Well, at the price of $1, 21 people want to buy this good. Only 5 of them are being provided to the market. Okay. So if that's the case, I have a shortage, right? More people want to buy this product. In fact, there's 16 people who want to buy this good at the current price, but no one is willing to supply them. So in order to supply more to the market, what would I have to do? Well, if the firms weren't willing to supply at that price of 1, to convince them to supply more to the market, I would have to see an increase in the price. So let's say we have this current shortage. In order to convince companies to sell more of this product, they're going to have to require a higher price. So if that's the case, we move to this higher price of $2. We might still have a shortage, but what has happened to the amount or the value of that shortage? As the price of the product increases, our shortage becomes smaller and smaller. Now, if I still have a shortage, there's more people that want to buy the good than what's being supplied. What has to happen in order for companies to supply more to the market? The price would have to go up. As the price goes up, more people want to supply this good, fewer people want to buy it, and this kind of continues to occur until we get to the point where every single unit being produced is being sold to someone. Right? So does that kind of answer your question along the way? I thought we'd get there. I was kind of going through that in that order. I wanted to make sure. Any other questions before we keep moving here? All right. So I'm going to skip over this a little bit just because for the sake of time and the types of questions I know I'm going to ask you on the quiz this week. If we have time, maybe I'll kind of come back to this at the end just to kind of make a point. But we've talked about surpluses and shortages quite a bit. How would I do this with some actual equations? So if I'm looking at these two equations and I have the following questions: what's the marginal benefit, cost, how do I find the equilibrium price and quantity, and is there a shortage or a surplus at a price of 60? So here we've got our demand equation, our supply equation. We have price is equal to 100 minus 5Q, and supply was 20 plus 15. So if I wanted to know the marginal benefit, what I have here, of the 5th unit, right? Well, if I want to know the marginal benefit to the consumer, which of these equations should I be using? Consumers are represented by the demand curve. In fact, the price from that demand curve, we said, reflects to us the marginal benefit of the consumers. So if I want the marginal benefit to the consumer of that 5th unit, all I do, that price would represent the first price they're willing to buy this good at. So that price must be, price is the cost to the consumer. It must be that is exactly equal to the consumer's marginal benefit. So price from the demand curve, really we can think of it as it reflects the marginal benefit of different quantities. If I want to know the marginal benefit of the 5th unit, all I do is plug that quantity of 5 in. That price is telling me the marginal benefit. So here we would have what? 75, if I'm doing math in my head correctly. Now, if I'm instead thinking about the marginal cost, and I think the question in the slide was, what's the marginal cost of the 3rd unit? How would I find that? Well, what represents producers' marginal costs? I should be looking at the supply curve, right? We said the price there from the supply curve, that's telling me the marginal costs to the producers. So if I want to know the marginal cost of the 3rd unit, I just plug a 3 into my supply equation, and that price tells me the first price they're willing to provide that to the market. So that price is the producer's marginal benefit. So it must be that that price was the first price that was exactly equal to the marginal cost of producing that unit. So if I plug that quantity in, my supply equation essentially tells me the marginal cost to the supplier or the producer. So this would be what? 45, so 65 here. Okay. So I can find marginal costs and marginal benefits using these equations. We kind of have already looked at that. How would I find my equilibrium quantity and my equilibrium price? Well, visually, yeah, it's the point where supply is equal to demand. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take my supply equation, set that equal to my demand equation. Now here, technically, this is the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, but we know that when this market is in equilibrium, those are the same thing. So we can just kind of write this as Q. It's the kind of equilibrium quantity. So it's just a little bit of algebra here, right? So I subtract 20 from both sides, add 5Q to both sides, and I get what? 20Q is equal to 80, divide both sides by 20. I get that my equilibrium quantity is 4. Okay. So the first thing I'll do is set those equations equal to each other. That lets me know when the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, or we just found an equilibrium quantity of 4. Now here, how would I get the equilibrium price? So this is a good way to check to make sure I didn't make a math mistake. What should be true at the equilibrium quantity? That the price is exactly the same if I was to look at the supply or demand equation, or the marginal cost of that last unit produced in the market is the same as the marginal benefit to consumers of that last unit consumed in the market. So if I go back to my supply and demand equation, it doesn't matter which one I use. If I plug in my equilibrium quantity, which here is 4, I should get that equilibrium price. I could do the same thing, but if I'm using my supply equation, hopefully I get the same price. So if I plug a 4 in here, sure enough, using either the supply or demand curve, once I find that equilibrium quantity, I should get the same equilibrium price from either equation, if I've done my math correct. So the first thing you would do, set supply equal to demand, kind of do a little bit of algebra to solve for that equilibrium quantity. Go back, plug that equilibrium quantity into your supply or demand curve, or both, just to make sure you're getting the same value to find the equilibrium price. Any questions on anything here in this process? I can give you any different equations, which I likely will do in the practice problems and the actual quiz. I'll give you different. In fact, I might write a question where everybody gets different values, right? So you'll have a supply and demand equation. You go through the same exact process. Okay. All right. So the last thing we'll talk about today, and we've set up a good amount of time talking about supply and demand shifts. So let's think through, okay, we can now identify the equilibrium price and quantity. What happens though if supply and demand shift? Well, now if I have a new supply curve or a new demand curve, what's going to be true about my equilibrium point? It's going to be something different, right? So this will be the kind of general steps we think through. What type of shift do we have? Is it in supply or demand, right? And then is it an increase or a decrease? And then given that increase or decrease in supply or demand, how is that going to influence my equilibrium price and quantity? So we'll kind of walk through some examples. I think this will make more sense as we start to kind of talk through this. So I've got kind of some open slides here. We'll start walking through some examples. I wrote some things down to have kind of some more real world. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to put these on kind of well, I can do different graphs here. So let's say I've got quantity, I've got price, I've got my supply curve, I've got my demand curve, which represents kind of marginal benefits. Let's assume, so the first thing I'll do is say, okay, where is my initial equilibrium price and quantity. It's where that supply curve is equal to my demand curve. Let's say I have an inferior good, right? If I see income go up, what's going to happen to the demand for an inferior good? We said if people have more money, they stop buying things they didn't want to buy, right? These inferior products, ramen noodles, right? Old versus new cars, etc. So if I see an increase in income for an inferior good, it's like kind of match those together. I'm actually going to see a demand decrease. What does a demand decrease look like? A shift to the, got to get this down. Anytime I have a decrease in something, I'm getting closer to 0. So a demand decrease is going to be a shift to the left, right? So I've identified this change that happened. It was an increase in income. How did that impact demand? Well, it caused demand to decrease. Where is my new equilibrium price and quantity? Well, kind of intuitively, if fewer people want to buy this product, what do you think is going to happen to the equilibrium quantity? It's going to go down. If fewer people are willing to buy this product, do you think I can get away with charging a higher or lower price than before? If everybody wants to buy something, do you think I can get away with charging a higher or lower price? Higher. If fewer people want to buy something, can I charge as high of a price? No. That equilibrium price is going to go down. So anytime we have demand decreases, we will always see that that equilibrium quantity goes down and that equilibrium price, is going to go down. Right? I'm writing quick. I'm trying to talk. So this would be kind of the effect of a demand decrease. We could also go through the same thing, right? But think about a demand increase, right? So what's that going to look like? So let's say I have a similar setup. I start out, here's my supply and demand curve. Here's my kind of current equilibrium quantity and my current equilibrium price. Let's say now, let's just do an easy one. Let's say I see the number of consumers, right? Maybe I have this good that there's just a fad for, or I get a celebrity endorsement. If the number of consumers goes up, what impact is that going to have on my market demand curve? There's more people that want to buy this product. Market demand is going to be higher or increase. What does an increase in demand look like? A shift to the right. Okay. Where is my new equilibrium point? Where my new demand curve hits that supply curve. That's going to be at a, well, if more people want to buy this good, unsurprisingly, the equilibrium quantity went up. Also, if more people want to buy this good, I know that I can get away with charging higher prices. Right? Think about this like right now, like any IU apparel. I'm likely guessing there's more being sold, and the prices it's being sold for are higher than it was 2 weeks ago. Okay? So we've got demand increases and decreases, which will impact our equilibrium price and quantity. We're going to have the exact same thing, but for supply increases or decreases as well. It's not that much different. So if I wanted to do these supply increases and decreases, I've kind of got them kind of in the kind of a summary of these, both demand and supply increases, demand and supply decreases. And we'll then kind of think about what happens if they occur at the same time. So at this point, we'll go through here. I'm going to make sure I change the time on this so we have a little bit more time to work on this. So I think today's code that I have should be 72.67. So once I get this published, go to the home page, come down here. I've got 3.2, right? So you'll click on this quiz. 72.67 should be what gets you into that quiz. I'll kind of give you the next 9 minutes. So let's make sure I have that number. Yeah, 72.67. So let's go here. I think I've got, yeah, we've got a bunch of stuff going on here. Okay. So I'll give you kind of the next 8 or 9 minutes. I think I have it set to be 9:05. So I'll probably at, 9:03, so kind of make sure you're kind of finishing up, and make sure I remind you, you have to click submit prior to that due date and time in class. So talk to the people around you, work on these for the next 6, 7 minutes. I'll kind of then prompt you to make sure you're getting it submitted. We'll kind of talk through them and then kind of go through one more thing, which is simultaneous shifts. So in each example, you've got something that is either going to shift supply or demand. I'm not even asking you for the impact on the equilibrium price and quantity. I'm just asking you which depiction would represent your kind of change in supply and demand, kind of in each of these 3 different questions, okay? I'm likely not going to give you the answers to these, so you need to get them correct to earn the full points. So half you answer them, half you get it correct. So talk to the people around you, take these seriously in the next remaining kind of 6 minutes or so.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, wait, my mind. That's all. Yeah, so that would have to be. No, yeah. So, yeah, so yeah, you have to look at it. Yeah. Some people go into this case, yeah, it's like the use of this. It's like, so it's making more clear the bias. Yeah, I mean, like making sure not affecting as applied, affecting the mid. But it's oh wait, I yeah.
All right, what you're reading, like, so it's like the same thing, like it's it's still and then let's talk about it. Yes. Yeah, well, it's because they're gonna make you. I don't think because it's process of production. I don't know. This manager.
All right. So I got that due date time set to be 9:05. So I put a little bit of buffer on there to make sure you're all getting it submitted. So make sure kind of having a response to each one of those questions, and you're getting it submitted now before 9:05. Do not wait till 9:05 and then accidentally get it submitted at 9:06. I'm telling you now because we have a couple minutes prior to that. So make sure you're getting that quiz submitted right now. Right? If you email me after class and said, well, I didn't get it until after 9:05, I'm telling you now to submit it. Right? That way I know you were told to submit it prior to 9:05. So if it's late, I can only assume you weren't in class. Right? So we will kind of talk through the final two questions, but I'm going to combine them to look through the last topic. That does not mean wait until we talk through them because I'm not giving you the answer to them. I'm just using those examples to kind of show you what's going to happen if we have simultaneous shifts. So the only example I've shown you up to this point, or the only thing we should really be able to think about, are how changes or shifts in supply or demand, one at a time, would influence that equilibrium price and quantity. Now, we often are going to do this visually, right? It kind of nice helps to see this on a graph. So let's think about if I have two simultaneous shifts, right? What's going to happen, right? So initially, I started out with my supply and demand curve here. I'm going to draw out two different ones. So I'm going to put a graph down here. We'll think about a second scenario in just a second. But here's our kind of current supply and demand curve. If I have substitutes in production, so this is where when I'm giving you questions, don't assume anything other than what the problem tells you. Yes, gas and electric vehicles might be substitutes in consumption, but here I'm just telling you there's substitutes in production. If I use the word production, what should you think about as shifting? Supply, right? So if all of a sudden gasoline vehicles I can't sell for as much money, if I have a production process I can build either type of car, which one am I going to be more likely to want to produce now? Electric vehicles, right? Because I can't sell gas-powered vehicles for as high of a price. So what's going to happen to the supply of electric vehicles if the price of gas vehicles goes down? If I'm more likely to want to produce electric vehicles now, its supply curve is going to, if I produce more of something, the supply increases. If we can't do this, we're going to have some problems, right? If I supply more of something, that means I'm seeing an increase in supply. Okay, so this was the first effect that I saw. Okay, now what happened, right, from this first effect? So here was kind of my initial equilibrium price and quantity. What did that supply increase do? It caused my price to go down and my quantity to go up. Okay. Now, what if instead I had a simultaneous change? So yes, the price of gas vehicles is going down, but at the same time, the government is giving subsidies to the consumers or people that purchase electric vehicles. Well, if I give people money for buying something, if I see the word consumer, what should I think about as shifting? Demand. If I give people money for buying something, demand is going to increase. If you're given money to do something, you're going to do more or less of it. More, right? You're going to demand more of that product. Now, I'm going to draw this out here so that my demand increase is relatively small, right? So compared to the initial equilibrium price, if I were to just think about what impact did that demand increase have, well, it pushed the price, what? So the new point, if I don't consider this new demand curve would have hit my old supply curve right here. So what did that do? It increased the price. I guess I should use 3 here. Sorry, not 2. All right. It increased the price and quantity. So I had an increase in the price, increase in the quantity. So these things happened at the same time. Yeah. Because I'm just looking at the impact of this second thing. I'm looking at each one happening individually. Right? So if only this happens, what was going to be the effect? If only this happened, what was going to be the effect? So I'm assuming just that it didn't happen at the same time. So I could draw them out in separate graphs if that helps. Anytime I have a demand increase, price and quantity are going to go up. Anytime I have a supply increase, price is going to go down, quantity is going to go up. Now, if they happen at the same time, what is the total effect going to be? Well, if these happen at the same time, what's definitely going to happen to the equilibrium quantity? If both of them are driving the equilibrium quantity up, I know the equilibrium quantity is going to go up. But what's going to happen to that equilibrium price? I don't know, right? Because one of these changes is pushing the price up, one of these changes is pushing the price down. So this is where we have kind of an additional answer that we start seeing pop up in economics, which is indeterminate. I cannot say. Unless you tell me which of these effects was larger, I don't know what's going to happen to the equilibrium price. Now, I know the equilibrium quantity is going to go up because both changes were driving up that quantity, but they're pushing price in opposite directions. So unless you tell me what shift was larger, I don't know. Now, I drew this in a particular way to kind of make this point. If I did happen these at the same time, to your question, where is the new equilibrium? It's where the new supply and the new demand curve intersect, which I drew this, tried to do it proportionally. Was the shift in supply greater or less than the shift in demand? Much greater. I tried to draw this visually. So what effect should kind of win out? The effect of that supply shift. Sure enough, that new equilibrium point, if I were to call this like, Q4 and P4, this would be kind of like the total effect. Quantity went up. We said that for sure was going to happen. But price here, because the supply shift was larger, price went down. Now, I'm not going to ask you questions about comparing the relative size of shifts. As far as what I would expect you to know is if I have simultaneous shifts, I sometimes have to say that the answer is indeterminate. In the real world, it's not indeterminate because if we know what shift is larger, we then know what the ultimate total effect is going to be. But as far as what I'll ask you to do, understand the impact that both of those shifts would have on the equilibrium price and quantity. If they're both pushing quantity in the same direction, you know that it's going to increase. Or if they're both decreasing, it's going to decrease. If they're ever pushing price or quantity in opposite directions, that's where the answer is. It's indeterminate. So we'll walk through a second example, and I want a little bit more room here. And we'll go through it relatively quickly, just given how much time we have remaining. So let's do a different one. Maybe this is maybe a better way of kind of approaching this. Okay. So let's say here I've got my initial equilibrium price and quantity, and let's do some different things here. So let's say I have a supply decrease. Okay. So my supply decrease would be a shift to the left. I'm going to identify what did that supply decrease do to my equilibrium price and quantity. Well, it pushed the quantity down and it pushed the price up. Okay? Now let's assume at the same time, so I've got my old equilibrium point. This is where I'm not going to put them on the same graph, because if I put them on the same graph, I might get confused. If I drew this supply curve shift really large, I might think the total effect is one thing, whereas if I drew the demand shift really large, maybe I think it's another. So this is a better way of approaching simultaneous shifts. So I'm using this to make the point of this can get confusing. If I draw each one out individually, I now know the impact of the supply decrease. Let's say I also at the same time see a demand increase. Well, what impact did that demand increase have on my equilibrium? It pushed the price up and it pushed quantity up. So if I then think about, okay, if I have this demand increase, quantity is going to go up, price is going to go up. What is my total effect, right? So I would usually kind of write these on top of each other. So I would say, okay, look, I had a supply decrease, that pushed quantity down and price up, while at the same time, I had this demand increase, which pushed my quantity up and also the equilibrium price up. So if I have these things happening at the same time, what was kind of my total effect? Well, what's definitely going to happen to price? If they're both increasing my equilibrium price and they happen at the same time, I know my equilibrium price is going to go up. What's going to happen to my equilibrium quantity? I don't know, right? They're pushing the quantity in opposite directions. So there the answer would be indeterminate. So if I was approaching these simultaneous shift problems, I would draw out each shift on a separate graph. I think using the shorthand then makes it very obvious to see. Oh, if I have arrows going in the same direction, I know that thing is going to either increase or decrease. If these two effects are pushing that thing in opposite directions, or I have arrows that are conflicting, I don't know what's happening to that. Right? I don't know what's happening to the equilibrium quantity here. And I tried to choose two examples where you can see sometimes the change in the price is indeterminate, sometimes it's the change in the quantity. It just depends on that combination of supply and demand increases or decreases. So I went through two combinations. There are two other combinations that you could work through, which I've got summarized here. All right. Here's kind of a depiction of supply and demand increases. We know quantity is going to go up. Who knows what's going to happen to the price? Supply and demand decrease. Quantity is definitely going to go down, but who knows what's going to happen to the price? And then the other two as well. And then kind of like the example I worked through, the way I would do this is when I have simultaneous changes, I would draw out each change individually and then kind of see, okay, if I have arrows going in the same direction or they're pushing this thing in the same direction, I know it's going to go in that direction. If they're ever pushing price or quantity in opposite directions, I don't know. Okay. All right. So one more thing before we get out of here. So the answer to quiz question 5. And I thought that might stop some people. So this is where just give me a little bit of time sometimes at the end of class, right? So we've got that Canvas discussion. If you go to, I've got it under the module 2 materials. Where is it at? Called Chat GPT and Productivity. Okay. So I gave you some articles. You can kind of, you don't have to read them word for word, kind of skim through them. I provide you some questions or things to kind of think about on this topic of Chat GPT and worker productivity. I want you to try to tie that or relate it to topics that we've talked about in class, which we could think about the production possibilities curve, right? You could even now think about changes in the supply curve. I then want you to look at this data set. So you'll get 5 points for your initial response to that post, right? People are asking me word limits, things like that. As long as it's a well thought out, well constructed kind of response to that, you'll get credit. So this is likely probably going to require a couple paragraphs, 2 paragraphs, maybe I would say would probably be sufficient. But what you need to do in those 2 paragraphs is not only kind of respond to some of those questions or write your thoughts on this specific topic, but you need to use something in this data set. I'm going to guess if you go to it and go to this economy productivity, go to one of these things where maybe I'm looking at productivity by industry. Industries I think might be impacted more or less by ChatGPT. Maybe I use some of those values, right? Accessing kind of that table to try to tie that into whatever my response was. Right? This is where it's not going to be super stringent as long as you're mentioning some kind of point in that data set. And this is where I just want you to get some familiarity using data sets. As long as you tie something from this data source to your response, that's worth another 5 points. And then responding to 2 other students' responses, the initial post, will get you 5 points each. So you need to have your initial response, tie in something from this data set, and then 2 other responses or a response to 2 other students' initial posts. Okay? That is due at the end of the day Monday. So you have an additional thing on top of the quiz and module reading. Other than that, stay warm. Stay safe. Look for the announcements about office hours tomorrow, and I will see you on Tuesday.